gonna kick this shit off by saying, fuck y'all. I don't gotta prove my name on a motherfucking thing. Every time I get mentioned, one of y'all bitch ass niggas get 24 hours of attention. So I'm gonna get this shit off my chest and then I'm gonna let this rest. Alafia, and welcome back to Black Love Free. I'm Brendane, a Gemini, an energy healer, a hoodoo, and a student of the Orisha Isheshe tradition of Ifa. In today's video, we're going to talk about the black men, the bots, the others who thought it was appropriate to attack me and threaten me on the internet. None of the work I do is for you, but you insist on coming onto every single platform I have and attacking me. And I'm tired. I'm tired of having to be a survivor of a movement that is supposed to free me. I'm tired of hearing more and more and more stories of Black women, Black girls, Black queer and trans people who are experiencing violation in the spaces that they build. I just don't understand what kind of life you want to live, where you follow me from platform to platform, always have something to motherfucking say, but it's never really something of substance, nor does it really ever make sense. Aren't you tired of the pathetic existence that you've been living? Aren't you tired of your validation being throwing barbs at random people that you don't fucking know on the internet? The amount of digital misogynoir that I experienced last year when I put out the video saying the only way to save the Black community is to hold Black men accountable was an astronomical amount. It just reaffirmed all that I knew about my research. It reaffirmed the purpose of my work. It reaffirmed my commitment to the freedom and the liberation of Black, gender marginalized people. And it also showed me a few other things. Hit dogs will holler. Those who see themselves in calls for accountability as being targeted or genocided, because that was one of the allegations that was thrown at me, that I was calling for the genocide of the Black man. You saw yourself in that pathetic existence, and it's a bit unfortunate. You niggas clearly are affected by the economic downturn and thus have fashioned bashing Black women on the internet as a job, but I don't know who's paying you. I don't know why you think it pays to be agents of empire, but by all means, do whatever it is you need to do. It's been interesting to see the accounts who were brave enough to put their human face in their AVI or in their video response. And it was really brave, I say that, because it seemed that none of you had enough karmic good left to keep your hairlines intact. So you're bald and you're on the internet talking about me. How distasteful. I found it especially hilarious that one of you spent over 3 hours of YouTube's memory storage to do a deep dive on me, but you don't even have the capacity, the intelligence, the will, or the ability to recognize the difference between a doctoral dissertation and an undergraduate honors thesis. But that's okay. I watched your video for about 10 seconds just so I can get a flavor of what your quote unquote critique was. And you started by saying, this is why we can't have this kind of education. And you know what I really value as a scholar, and what the academy values in scholarship is innovation. And your arguments actually in those 10 seconds, because I didn't listen to anything else or anything more, really demonstrated is that this age-old form of misogyny can only fit into a certain type of academic or scholarly study that is not innovative. And we'll look at that today. We have some words from the scholar Anna Julia Cooper, who was writing in the 1800s about the things that niggas was saying and doing, about the ways that they discounted education for women. All I have to say to that is maybe you all should find something new to say. In addition to the text that we'll talk about today, I also screenshot some of the harassing and threatening comments that I received. There are some that I feel are teachable and really illustrate what we'll talk about today. And I figured for those of you who call yourselves homegrown scholars, who do the scholarship of going around and bashing Black feminism, that I might demonstrate to you what analysis looks like, since so many of you are confused. This is the last day of Women's History Month, after all, that I'm recording this. So I figured, why not bring women from across time and space to talk about the age-old issue of Black men and the harm that they do to Black communities and Black freedom movements. I'm hoping that the conversation about misogynoir and tracing the hundreds years long tradition of Black cis men disparaging Black women and others in our community might serve as enough for us to let these niggas go, because it is time. It's past time. Let the leaders of our community fight and fend for themselves. Let them free themselves, because our labor and our presence is not appreciated. Before we get started, I want to clear the air around what misogynoir is, what digital misogynoir is, because I know that some of us might not be familiar. So, what is misogynoir? Misogynoir is a topic that a lot of Black feminists have talked about. They've talked about misogynoir in the physical realm as well as in the digital realm. But in case you haven't heard of it, here's a very quick breakdown. Misogynoir is a portmanteau, which means that it's a word made from multiple words in different languages. So misogynoir is derived from the English word misogyny plus the French word noir, which means black. And if we take that word literally, right, it means black misogyny. Misogyny is defined as, quote, the dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women. And it came about in the 16th century. There's some other things that also came about in the 16th century, right? We have the advent of slavery. So if we think about that just general context, right? Misogyny arrives in the world specifically out of a colonialist anti-Black space. Its roots are the Greek words misos, which means hatred, and gun, which means woman. So if we take all of that together, misogynoir is a word that means the hate of Black women. And it is something that is expressed, right, through dislike, through contempt, through an ingrained form of prejudice. Misogynoir is not specific to Black men. It's not specific to men or women in that sense. It's not like only men can be misogynist. For a lot of women, misogyny is something that is ingrained in them. We all live in a patriarchal world, right? So they too can exercise misogynoir. This word was pulled together and explained and developed by Dr. Moya Bailey and Trudy. And they invented this word to describe the unique form of misogyny that Black women experience, especially online. With the advent of the internet and the technology of YouTube, the technology of Twitter, the technology of all these other platforms, we're able to see not just the proliferation of information, but also the proliferation of prejudice, of bigotry, and of violence against all people, but especially and specifically Black women. In recent years, digital misogynoir has emerged as a category of study for Black feminist scholars who experience it most closely. And so there are wonderful scholars like Dr. Kaylin Coggle and Dr. Feminista Jones who have detailed work about digital misogynoir that you can check out if you're interested in learning more. I've linked their channels in the description of this episode, along with the article about misogynoir. An extreme example of misogynoir is the death and violence threats that I received in response to my sharing a piece of my dissertation, not even a chapter, literally 3 pages of my dissertation in a presentation. It's not my first time experiencing this kind of violence, but it was really interesting to see just how my comments were deliberately misinterpreted. And I attribute that largely to the literacy problem that is especially deep among Black cis men. I can't even say that I'm too phased by it. Like, I have measures to protect myself. Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, the violent experiences that I've had with Black men in the physical realm have actually prepared me for everything that I saw and read. The good thing for me, though, is that I have divested from trying to save Black men a long time ago. So I'm not really concerned with what y'all think about me. I don't give a fuck. So the creation of this video, as I've said, is for those of us who find ourselves in positions, in movement spaces, in institutions where our bodily integrity, our safety is always seen as disposable when it comes to maintaining the safety and integrity of Black cis men and boys. This video is for you. This video is to provide some language, some context, some history to your experience, something to hold as you move through the loneliness, the isolation, the gaslighting, all of the things that happens when you choose to speak out about what has happened to you. So with that, we're going to move to tracing this misogynoir through the centuries. Black women have been questioning Black men's treatment of them for hundreds of years. I can't go back through the entire history because then I would have to start on the continent. But I'll start with Anna Julia Cooper's essay called The Higher Education of Women, which is published in her book, A Voice from the South, in 1892. And in this essay, she talks about interracial gender politics. She starts by laying out the forces of the world that is, the forces that brought domination and patriarchy into the world. And she says, whence came this apathesis of greed and cruelty? Whence this sneaking admiration we all have for bullies and prize fighters? Whence the self-congratulation of dominant races, as if dominant meant righteous, and carried with it a title to inherit the earth? Whence the scorn of so-called weak or unwarlike races and individuals, and the very comfortable assurance that it is their manifest destiny to be wiped out as vermin before this advancing civilization? As if the possession of the Christian graces of meekness, non-resistance, and forgiveness were incompatible with the civilization professedly based on Christianity, the religion of love. And so in this quote, she's talking about the dominant, violent ideology of patriarchy, one that is rooted simultaneously in a European form of colonization, that title to inherit the earth, the scorn of the so-called weak or unwarlike races and individuals. She's rooting and really analytically tying together for us white supremacy, European supremacy, patriarchy, and settler colonialism. She's also tying them together with the hypocrisy or paradox of Christianity in its practice. She says, what does it mean to be in possession of the Christian graces of meekness, right, which one would see as the opposite of domination, non-resistance, and forgiveness? How is that deemed to be incompatible with the civilization that is professedly based on Christianity, the religion of love? All of these things only make sense if we think about the ways that these different ideologies contort and twist themselves to maintain power and domination. So Christianity can at one hand be the religion of love, and on the other be the religion that allows one to be righteous and inherit the earth. This is only possible through a patriarchal, white supremacist, anti-Black orientation to love, to power, and to others. So she moves from this writing of the world that is, and she describes the experience of the woman in that world. And she says, as individuals, we are constantly and inevitably, whether we are conscious of it or not, giving out our real selves in our several little worlds, inexorably adding our own true ray to the flood of starlight, quite independently of our professions and our masquerading. And so in the world of thought, the influence of thinking woman far transcends her feeble declamation and may seem at times even opposed to it. She's describing the unrecognized power of women in their communities. This focus on men, their ability to shift and change the world, and how that leaves women in the work that we do in the shadows. She even goes on to talk about, right, the progenitors of the pygmies, those women who engage in self-betrayal and self-abandonment because they think that that is what will give them the love that their mama, their daddy, the grandma, or whoever didn't show them. These women often masquerade as free thinkers. They often masquerade as folks who are unbridled by the oppression of feminist thinking because they choose to extend their hands to niggas who wouldn't spit on them even if they were on fire. This shit ain't nothing new. Folks have been dealing with these kinds of people for hundreds of years, but I really enjoy Anna Julia Cooper's description of them, where she says that the average woman retired before these shafts of wit and ridicule and even gloried in her ignorance is not surprising. The Abchosi, it is said, praised the Duchess de Font as being as pretty as an angel and silly as a goose. And all the young ladies of the court strove to make up in folly what they lacked in charms. The ideal of the day was that, quote, women must be pretty, dress prettily, flirt prettily, and not be too well informed. That it was the summum bonum of her earthly hopes to have, as Thackeray puts it, quote, all the fellows battling to dance with her. That she had no God given destiny, no soul with unquenchable longings and inexhaustible possibilities, no work of her own to do and to give to the world, no absolute and inherent value, no duty to self, transcending all pleasure giving that may be demanded of a mere toy, but that her value was purely a relative one, and to be estimated as are the fine arts by the pleasure they give. In the attacks that I experienced online and continue to experience, there are often Black women who feel themselves to be the bulldogs and the warriors who take up the Black man baby in their arms and come from me, or attempt to, at least. They say, well, what about the Black woman who abandoned her child? What about the Black woman who abuses? How can we hold Black men accountable if we are not punishing the Black woman as well? And this is unoriginal thinking, to say the least. But one thing that it does make me think about is that folks will be in the same room as the point. They might even be sitting next to the point. They might even be trying to share a chair with the point, but they still won't get the point. Folks often try to derail the cries and the clamors of Black women, Black girls, Black children, Black queer and trans people who are calling for accountability and justice. They often try to quell those by bringing up other groups of people who haven't done right, as if we must address all of those things first before we can even ask for Black men to be the leaders they claim they want to be in our communities. It's illogical thinking, to say the least, but y'all got it. Anna Julia Cooper goes on to talk more about these patriarchal ideas that shaped men's and women's roles in the world. And she says, men believed or pretended to believe that the great law of self-development was obligatory on their half of the human family only. That while it was the chief end of man to glorify God and put his 5 talents to the exchangers, gaining thereby other 5, it was or ought to be the sole end of woman to glorify man and wrap her one decently away in a napkin, retiring into, quote, Hezekiah Smith's lady during her natural life and Hezekiah Smith's relic on her tombstone. That higher education was incompatible with the shape of the female cerebrum, and that even if it could be acquired, it must inevitably unsex woman, destroying the lisping, clinging, tenderly helpless, and beautifully dependent creatures whom men could so heroically think for and so gallantly fight for, and giving in their stead a formidable race of blue stockings with corkscrew ringlets and other spinster propensities. But these are 18th century ideas. The idea that Black women and other women could develop themselves and that be seen as a threat to men's standing in the world is an idea that has been circulating since the fucking 1700s. Please, all I ask is that you niggas come up with something new. She says, this may have been true when it was written. It is not true today. The old, subjective, stagnant, indolent, and wretched life for woman has gone. She has as many resources as men, as many activities beckon her on, as large possibilities swell and inspire her heart. And these days, a lot of us have more. I just think about how so many of you were attacking me as I was sharing my presentation that I gave in Senegal. Some of you who were attacking me probably had never seen what life is like outside of your mom's basement. Some of you probably didn't even know that there's a grocery store beyond the end of your block. And I'm sure that enraged you a bit. To know that I could travel the world and share my ideas. That the old, subjective, stagnant, indolent, and wretched life for me as a Black woman, descendant of enslaved Black people, could do that. But I digress. Anna Julia Cooper asks, now then, does it destroy or diminish her capacity for loving? Because that is always what y'all say. Feminism prevents Black women from loving. Black men in the Black community, it prevents Black women from submitting to Black men in the community. Education and knowing these things and having these experiences, it prevents Black women from getting down on their knees and accepting not coming after fucking you and prioritizing your pleasure over theirs. But Anna Julia Cooper says her standards have undoubtedly gone up. The necessity of speculating in chances has probably shifted. The question is not now with the woman, how shall I so cramp, stunt, simplify, and nullify myself as to make me eligible to the honor of being swallowed up in some little man? That's no longer the question. The problem, I trow, now rests with the man as to how he can so develop his God-given powers as to reach the ideal of a generation of women who demand the noblest, grandest, and best achievements of which he is capable. And this surely is the only fair and natural adjustment of the chances. Nature never meant that the ideals and standards of the world should be dwarfing and minimizing ones. And the men should thank us for requiring of them the richest fruits which they can grow. If it makes them work, all the better for them. But you niggas don't see it that way. You see rising to the standards of someone who refuses to shrink. You see doing the actual work, for some of you, of reading and writing and learning and changing as life-threatening. You see that as fucking genocide. What are we to do when the future of our race, when the future of our communities are in the hands of people and in the minds of people and in the deeds of people who are afraid to fucking change, who want to be regarded as gods, but can't even perform the miracle of washing their asses? I don't even know what to say or what to do at this point, which is why I divested. First of all, why is it even a challenge to do right and not harm people? Well, we know why, because we live in a patriarchal world that says that domination is the way to gain power. We know why. That is a challenge for some of you, most of you, maybe all of you. But then why would you not want to rise to the occasion? To be a good man rather than to just be regarded as one? Why would you not want to earn goodness and grace? Why do you simply want to be given it all the time? And you don't even ask this of white people. You ask this of the people who are already taking care of you, who are already doing the work to make up for your shortcomings, over functioning for the Black man in our communities at the expense of our health, of our life, of our time. Are you niggas capable or not? quickly make a decision. And you always want to come and threaten us and say, well, you won't have the love that you want. You won't have the love that you need if you don't submit, if you don't refuse this learning, this education, if you don't refuse to self-abandon, if you don't refuse this, you will die lonely. Like all of the empty threats that you niggas be giving. And the thing is, apparently, that too is old. Because Anna Julia Cooper also talks about that in this essay. She contends with them for a bit. But the part of the essay that I think really illustrates the false competition that Black men, Black cis men in particular, see themselves in with other Black people. She talks about that as well. And she starts by talking about it from a white vantage point, right? This pitting of Black men against Black women has its roots in anti-Blackness, has its roots in a certain kind of white supremacist patriarchy that influences and shapes a Black patriarchy. But she says, others ask questions too, sometimes, and I was asked a few years ago by a white friend, how is it that the men of your race seem to outstrip the women in mental attainment? Oh, I said, so far as it is true, the men, I suppose, from the life they lead, gain more by contact. And so, as it is only apparent, I think the women are far more quiet. They don't feel called to mount a barrel and harangue by the hour every time they imagine they have produced an idea. But I'm sure there is another reason which I did not at the time see fit to give. The atmosphere, the standards, the requirements of our little world do not afford any special stimulus to female development. It seems hardly a gracious thing to say, but it strikes me as true that while our men seem thoroughly abreast of the times on almost every other subject, when they strike the woman question, they drop back into 16th century logic. They leave nothing to be desired generally in regard to gallantry and chivalry. But they actually do not seem sometimes to have outgrown the old contemporary of chivalry. The idea that women may stand on pedestals or live in dollhouses, if they happen to have them. But they must not furrow their brows with thought or attempt to help men tug at the great questions of the world. I fear the majority of colored men do not yet think it worthwhile that women aspire to higher education. Not many will subscribe to the advanced ideas of Grant Allen already quoted. The 3 R's, a little music and a good deal of dancing, a first-rate dressmaker, and a bottle of magnolia balm are quite enough generally to render charming any woman possessed of tact and the capacity of worshiping masculinity. 16th century logic that we talked about, this logic that arose out of the time that the word misogyny was invented, this hatred, belittling and deriding of women that has happened for centuries, that it seems that to Anna Julia Cooper, to me, to the organizers I know and love, that these niggas are still holding on to. This is something that Anna Julia Cooper witnessed again and again in her lifetime. And she goes on to say more about what her experience was. And she says, I was put into a school near home that professed to be normal and collegiate, i.e., to prepare teachers for colored youth, furnish candidates for the ministry, and offer collegiate training for those who should be ready for it. Well, I found after a while that I had a good deal of time on my hands. I had devoured what was put before me, and like Oliver Twist, was looking around to ask for more. She was like, can I have some more learning, please? Please, please. I had devoured what was put before. I constantly felt, as I suppose many an ambitious girl has felt, a thumping from within, unanswered by any beckoning from without. Class after class was organized for these ministerial candidates, many of them men who had been preaching before I was born. And to every one of these classes I was expected to go, with the sole intent, I thought at the time, of enabling the dear old principal, as he looked from the vacant countenance of his sleepy old class over to where I sat, to get off his solitary pun, his never failing pleasantry, especially in hot weather, which was, as he called out, anyone, to the effect that anyone then meant anyone. And for those of you who didn't catch that, she said that she felt like she was only in those classes because the principal wanted to be able to look to someone and see that someone was paying attention and able to answer his questions. But she continues. Finally, a Greek class was to be formed. My inspiring preceptor informed me that Greek had never been taught in the school, but that he was going to form a class for the candidates for the ministry. And if I liked, I might join it. I replied, humbly I hope, as became a female of the human species, that I would like very much to study Greek, and that I was thankful for the opportunity. And so it went on. A boy, however meager his equipment and shallow his pretensions, had only to declare a floating intention to study theology, and he could get all the support, encouragement, and stimulus he needed, be absolved from work and invested beforehand with all the dignity of his faraway office, while a self-supporting girl had to struggle on by teaching in the summer and working after-school hours to keep up with her board bills, and actually to fight her way against positive discouragements to the higher education. To one such girl one day flared out and told the principal, quote, the only mission opening before a girl in his school was to marry one of those candidates, end quote. He said he didn't know, but it was. And when at last that same girl announced her desire and intention to go to college, it was received with about the same incredulity and dismay as if a brass button on one of those candidates' coats had propounded a new method for squaring the circle or trisecting the arc. And this is something that we continue to see in Black communities today. And I talk about this a bit in my dissertation and in that presentation, right? This idea of self-power, the idea that if we invest in Black men and boys, we give everything we have to give to them, then they will be successful and they will then be able to uplift the race. And what this does is shift resources away from Black girls, shifts resources away from Black women as well. And it really is this false patriarchal notion that our men and our boys will be the ones who save us. And underneath that notion is this acknowledged and unacknowledged belief that we as women, as girls, as queer and trans people should submit to a lot in life where we are always lesser than those who have certain forms of dominant power under white supremacist, anti-Black patriarchy. But Anna Julia Cooper, because she's doing this, over 130 years ago, she still has a little hope. So she says, I ask the men and women who are teachers and coworkers for the highest interests of the race that they give the girls a chance. We might as well expect to grow trees from leaves as hope to build up a civilization or a manhood without taking into consideration our women and the home life made by them, which must be the root and ground of the whole matter. So throwing our hopes into the growth of our civilization, quote unquote, into the growth of our race, into the growth of our people, into men, she likens to growing trees from leaves while ignoring women and the home life, which is the root and the ground. She says, let us insist then on special encouragement for the education of our women and special care in their training. Let our girls feel that we expect something more of them than that they merely look pretty and appear well in society. Teach them that there is a race with special needs which they and only they can help, that the world needs and is already asking for their trained, efficient forces. Finally, if there is an ambitious girl with pluck and brain to take the higher education, encourage her to make the most of it. Let there be the same flourish of trumpets and clapping of hands as when a boy announces his determination to enter the lists. And then, as you know, that she is physically the weaker of the two, don't stand from under her and leave her to buffet the waves alone. Let her know that your heart is following her, that your hand, though she sees it not, is ready to support her. To be plain, I mean, let money be raised and scholarships be founded in our colleges and universities for self supporting, worthy young women to offset and balance the aid that can always be found for boys who will take theology. So, if you think about this, right? The paradoxical, hypocritical logic of patriarchy that says men are stronger, they're more physically inclined for certain things. They have the capacity, the mental capacity, the ability, the power, the will to dominate. If they have this, and women are supposedly weaker, children are supposedly weaker, then why is it that we have to shore up all of our resources under men who already supposedly have the power? Anna Julia Cooper calls our attention to this logic by saying, if you niggas are the strong ones, then we need to be putting the resources up under the people who are weak. But if we're not thinking critically, right? If we are taking up the logic of white supremacy, of patriarchy, uncritically, then yeah, we think that we should give more to the dominant. And I'm not saying I believe in biological determinations around strength, power, prowess when it comes to gender. I absolutely do not. I am speaking in binaries and speaking in this world, this realm of logic, just to uncover the fallacy of it. But I don't believe that men are inherently stronger than women. I don't believe in the binary of man and woman, but that is the gendered and sexed binary that rooted in a white supremacist view of the world that also structures patriarchy. I just want to make that clear. So then she rounds out her essay with this. The earnest, well trained Christian young woman, as a teacher, as a homemaker, as wife, mother, or silent influence, even, is as potent a missionary agency among our people as is the theologian. And I claim that at the present stage of our development in the South, she is even more important and necessary. Let us then, here and now, recognize this force and resolve to make the most of it. Not the boys less, but the girls more. And what she's essentially pointing to is this kind of false competition that is constructed through this adherence to a gendered form of relation in the world. That scarcity mindset around resources that says that we will be taking away from the boys if we give the girls more, but it's okay and acceptable to take away from the girls. And she's pointing to the fallacy of that logic and saying we don't have to take anything away from boys to give girls more. So that was Anna Julia Cooper. Like I said, this is not the beginnings of these logics about Black men's place in Black communities, but to root us in an understanding that we are fighting against hundreds of years of ideology that would require those of us who are not cis men and some cis men who have sexuality, ability, other differences, those of us who could be written or seen as weaker in the spectrum of domination. They require us to submit to these false ideas around power. And I want to move us to the 20th century. Folks often talk about the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the Black nationalist movement of the 1960s and 70s. We all have an idea of the gendered forms of violence that happened in those movements. But one person who really, I believe, provides an incisive view of the challenges of that time and explicitly a gendered analysis of the challenges of that time is Michele Wallace. In her book, Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. And we get a certain kind of tracing of the history of Black and other men's orientation to education for women through Anna Julia Cooper, who has a particular kind of education as a theologian in the South. Michele Wallace, in her work, actually brings us a different kind of historical telling of the relation between Black men and Black women in its current state. She roots us in slavery. She roots us in the difference in household roles for Black women, who were often breeders of children, Black men who were the ones siring the children, how Black women became more important in the slave household because of the gendered roles that were assigned to them. And she cites scholars of the time because around the time that this was written in the 70s, she is writing this to really combat the notion that was circulating inside and outside of the Black community that Black women were the detriment of our movements. We are the detriment of our households. It's a view that W.E.B. Du Bois held and wrote about in the Philadelphia Negro. It's the view that Daniel Patrick Moynihan took up in the Moynihan Report on the Negro family. The Black man in America has always been expected to function as less than a man. This was taken for granted and was the ugliest weight of his enslavement. The liberal white man has always promised the detesticled Black some progress to manhood. In other words, we will let your balls grow back one day. Just be cool. And in slavery times, theoretically, the slave master could make it with any Black woman he could get to. The Black man was powerless to do anything to prevent it. Many times he was even powerless to keep his woman with him or his children. One effect of this largely one-sided integration was to create a very deep hatred and suspicion in the Black man for any Black woman who had dealings with white men. This is a feeling that still exists. And this is quoted from Leroy Jones, American Sexual Reference, Black Male, and Michele Wallace comes back to say, the picture drawn for us over and over again is of a man who is a child, who is the constant victim of an unholy alliance between his woman and the enemy, the white man. It is an emotional interpretation, but it has also been used by the contemporary Black man to justify his oppression of the Black woman, to justify his getting ahead by walking over her prostrate body. Quote, I don't owe you anything, Black woman, because one, you sold me out, and two, you've always been ahead anyway. And we'll see a bit later how that showed up in some of the tweets and responses I got. She continues, the facts are a good deal more complicated and ambiguous. The slave family was constantly subject to disruptions by sales of children of father and mother. Black women did have sex with and bear children for their white masters. The slave father did lack traditional authority over his family. He could not control the destinies of either his wife or his children. For the most part, he could not provide for them and protect them. But to accept these features of slavery as the entire picture is to accept that the character of life in the Black slave community was solely a product of white oppression. And so when we hear men use these same old arguments today, they're continuing to capitulate the power to change their conditions and change their place in the Black community. So she continues with this history, this historical telling. And she says, to suggest that the Black man was emasculated by slavery is to suggest that the Black man and the Black woman were creatures without will. Slave men and women formed a coherent and, as much as possible, a beneficial code of behavior, values, and mores, a culture, a way of seeing and dealing with life that was based upon the amalgamation of their African past and the forced realities of their American experience. In other words, an African American culture. Yet the myth of the Black man's castration and slavery, or at least the joint participation of the white man and the Black woman in a ruthless attempt to castrate him, has been nurtured over a century, along with the Black man's contempt for the most imaginary self-sufficiency of the Black woman. But the presumed dominance of the Black female during slavery would not be quite enough to explain the full extent of Black male anger, especially since it was more untrue than not. And at some point, the Black man must have known that. Rather, his actual gripe must be, at least in part, that the Black woman, his woman, was not his slave, that his right to expect her complete service and devotion was usurped. She was, after all, the white man's slave. And so a lot of what we see and witness now in the resurgence of the manosphere is this idea that Black men have been done wrong because Black women are not their slaves. And that being like a important characteristic, a constitution of manhood. And we see that rhetoric spun around, slung around, up and down, all the way, uh, especially in the Black Power movement and Black nationalist movement. She references Eldridge Cleaver here when she talks about this. I won't give him any more space here because I don't believe in giving rapists a platform. But Eldridge Cleaver was a member of the Black Panther Party. He was someone who believed in using sexual violence as a primary tool of quote unquote revolution. And he saw that as one of the primary means for Black cis men to gain their manhood back. And so one of the things that he would often say is that we shall have our manhood. So much of the competition between Black men and Black women is framed through this idea that the white man used to be the one to keep Black men from succeeding. Like the white man used to be the one who would castrate. And the Black women have now taken that up through our strength, through our power, through our prowess. We are the ones who are now cutting off the scrotums of niggas. And so for Black men to gain their manhood back, they have to assert a kind of violence and domination that resembles that of their oppressors. This manhood that Cleaver references and that other Black men even today reference is one that is, in my opinion, is purely born from a complete and total submission and belief in the power of white supremacist definitions of the world. They take them up, chew them up in their mouths, and spit them back out and call it Black power, Black nationalism. And so Michele Wallace has a fascinating response to that. She says, if you accept the definition that America force-fed the Black man access to white women sexually and the systematic subjugation and suppression of Black women, then the answer is an unequivocal yes. But if we consider America's actual standard of manhood, control of the means of production and power, in other words, money, the answer has got to be no. And so what she astutely does here is present us with the definitions of manhood that Black men toggle between, because they are not as educated. They have lower rates of employment. They fall short in a lot of ways economically. They have to aim for this interpersonal affective form of power that is, fucking white women and subjugating Black women. That is how they access manhood. But that is nothing new. Michele Wallace then goes on to analyze how the substance of Black manhood becomes centered around his physical prowess, the size of his penis, his ability to fuck, because they are denied that economic form of manhood and they are not willing or able to contribute to the households that they create through participating in the creation of children. She talks about how the history of slavery, the contemporary culture and understanding of Black men, how that all swirls together to create this trope of the Black macho. And this is not something that is exclusive to Black cisgender heterosexual men. She also talks about how James Baldwin in his work uplifts and represents the Black macho as well. And so the Black movement then becomes a vehicle for this kind of Black macho ideology to spread in Black communities. And what that what that ideology stated, right, is that Black males, and I'm quoting Michele Wallace here, Black males who stressed a traditionally patriarchal responsibility to their women and children, to their communities, to Black people, were to be considered almost sissified. So it's gay to care for your people. That's not what real niggas do. That's not what real manly men do. It's gay to actually take care of your family. That's the ideology. It's like you're not a real man if you do these things. The black man's sexuality and the physical fact of his penis were the major evidence of his manhood and the purpose of it. And so she goes on to actually give us more information about the black macho. And she roots it in the work of Leroy Jones, who wrote an essay called American Sexual Reference, Black Male, that was published in 1965. And according to Jones, the struggle of black against white was the purity of primitivism against the corruption of technology. The noble savage against the pervert bureaucrats, the super macho against the. And Jones goes on to say that white manhood is one that doesn't sit with the physical. It's purely mental. It's one that moves away from the warrior, from the masculine, from that kind of deep, strong masculine. And this is a man who had a white wife and then got converted by the black nationalists. But what's especially important to note here is other figure that is thrown into this constellation of competition between black men and black women, and that is the white woman. And he says, the black man and the white woman were not supposed to have any connections, even in anybody's wildest fantasies. This is the greatest taboo of the society. This taboo did a number of things. For one, it created for such a possible black man, white woman union an aura of mystery and wild sensuality that could invoke either principle to investigate if either were intrepid or curious enough. The reason the white woman was supposed to be intrigued by the black man was because he was basic and elemental emotionally, which is true for the non-brainwashed black simply because there is no reason he should not be. The black man is more natural than the white simply because he has fewer things between him and reality, fewer wrappers, fewer artificial rules, therefore wilder, harder, and almost insatiable in his lovemaking. He admonishes black men for being taken in by the trap of pursuing white women, which is not to say that black men should spurn white pussy, but that they should seize it rather than grovel for it. Whereas Mailer's rallying cry to the primitive seemed half tongue-in-cheek, Jones's seemed deadly serious. The most heinous crime against white society would be the rape, the taking forcibly of one of Whitey's treasures. The average au fait thinks of the black man as potentially raping every white lady in sight, which is true, in the sense that the black man should want to rob the white man of everything he has. For most whites, the guilt of the robbery is the guilt of the rape. That is, they know in their deepest hearts that they should be robbed. And the white woman understands that only in the rape sequence is she likely to get cleanly, viciously popped. The black man, then, because he can enter into the sex act with less guilt as to its results, is freer. Because the robbery rape syndrome, the black man will take the white woman in a way that does not support the myth of the lady. Jones had transformed Mailer's sexual outlaw into the role model for the black revolutionary. The black man as robber rapist, take it further, it is murderer. A compelling fictional character, he is a fascist in real life. Black men, with the help of Jones and others like him, would take the prototype of man as warrior, as conqueror blind to the rights of all but himself, as rapist and psychopath turned soldier, and use it as the English settler had used a similar form of macho to place the American continent at his feet. So in this line of thinking, by primarily staking their definition of what it means to be a man in domination, in the sexual and other violations of people, they they take on the logic of their oppressors. And we see that quite clearly. But to dive more deeply into Black Macho, she says, Black Macho would have led to this conclusion. If whom you fuck indicates your power, then obviously the greatest power would be gained by fucking a white man first, a black man second, a white woman third, and a black woman not at all. The most important rule is that nobody fucks you. Black macho only allowed for the most primitive notion of women, women as possessions, women as the spoils of war, leaving black women with no resale value. As a possession, the black woman was a symbol of defeat, and therefore of little use to the revolution except as a performer of drudgery, not unlike her role in slavery, which, honey, that's the white man had offered white women privilege and prestige as accompaniments to his power. Black women were offered no such deal, just the same old hard labor, a new silence, and more loneliness. The patriarchal black macho of Malcolm X might have proven functional. Black women might have suffered their oppression for years in comparative bliss, but black men were blinded by their resentment of black women, their envy of white men, and their irresistible urge to bring white women down a peg. With patriarchal macho, it would have taken black men years to avenge themselves. With the narcissistic macho of the black movement, the results were immediate. And when the black man went as far as the adoration of his own genitals could carry him, his revolution stopped. A big afro, a rifle, and a penis in good working order were not enough to lick the white man's world after all. And so it is this narcissistic form of domination that we see continuing in our movements today, that I see shapes the way that black, cis, sometimes heterosexual men move in our movement spaces. And we are expected to submit to them because including them in our movements and in our communities is seen as the only way to liberation. But she critiques this. She talks about what can be remedied and what can be done. And she talks about this specific kind of victim complex that black men find themselves in, particularly in movement spaces. And so she talks about how folks at the time, they desert civil rights movement tactics because they depended too much upon the goodness of whites. And she then also deepens her critique and doesn't take up the common sense notion of the Black Power movement, which was that it was more empowering for Black people and Black men. And she says, but the Black movement turned out to be even less independent in its notion of freedom. There was a great deal more marching around with rifles and combat boots, of bad mouthing and threatening whites, than there was of actual revolutionary planning and action. What did this son of a slave actually expect whites to do? Did he expect, like the boy who was throwing a tantrum because he can't have something he wants, that Big Daddy would finally buy it for him just to shut him up? The black man had forgotten who he was. He had come to believe that his universe was really as the whites had defined it. The most important thing was no longer the welfare of his family, his people, but white racism. White racism is the white man's problem, not the black man's. His task is rather, and the black man post-slavery knew it, to ameliorate the manifestations of racism, his own poverty, deprivation, and unhappiness, to remove by whatever means necessary the restraints that exist on his health, his productivity, his creativity, and the perpetuation of his culture, the way of life that will allow him to live, survive, and flourish. But the contemporary black man no longer exists for his people or even for himself. He has made himself a living testament to the white man's failures. He must continue to suffer, to be brutalized, and to brutalize his peers until whites are able to become the better people that will be required to deliver him from his condition. He has become a martyr. And he has arrived in this place not because of the dependency inflicted upon him in slavery, but because his black perspective, like the white perspective, supported the notion that manhood is more valuable than anything else. As long as he was able to hold onto his own black-centered definition of manhood, his sense of himself was not endangered. But it was inevitable, as the time that he had been in this country lengthened, that he would get the black and white perspectives confused. He is unaware, has accepted a definition of manhood that is destructive to himself and that negates the best efforts of his past. And she talks about the class dimensions of this as well. It's not just race, class also plays a role in this, particularly when folks think about the solutions and the expectations they have for white people to be involved in them. And she says, middle class blacks insist upon believing that the white man should take care of their poor, upgrade the prisons, stop sending blacks to jail, clean up the mess in the slums, improve the schools, and make their children learn. I am not saying that white government and business, since they are partially sustained by black money, are not responsible and ought not to be tapped whenever possible, but that it is a time to recognize that we cannot expect very much from them in the way of initiative or cooperation in the solving of our problems. That is just the way it is. Big Daddy is no relation. Capitalism is dependent upon the notion of a big daddy. You are supposed to give the principal part of your production, the fruits of your labor, to someone else, and he will take care of you. Carl McCall, councilman in New York, has spoken about the dearth of Black leadership. He said basically that there were Black leaders, but that people didn't know it because whites failed to give these leaders anything to give Black people. That's my idea of dependency. And the poor Black man is implicated in this as well. Yes, forces conspire against him, but he allows life to happen to him. He allows others to make the decisions for him. He trusts the white bureaucracy enough to allow them to put him behind bars, to allow them to take care of his wife and children. He acts as though he and the Black woman are at war, as though he might win something by her destruction. He used the debilitating game of sexual superiority as a substitute for establishing something worthwhile. He's got nothing else, he says. He's got to have some fun, he says. That's how he's kept in his place. And just as fast as he can enter the Black middle class, he begins to turn white, or what he thinks is white. Slavery is a subject he never discusses, about which he knows little. Civil rights and Black movements have become nothing more than slightly amusing cocktail party conversation. And all because he's forgotten the hopes and aspirations of the slaves, forgotten what he's been through, and all of the lessons of these 400 years. At the very end of this section of the book, she makes a turn to the rest of us, one that I think is important for us to sit with. She says, finally, it is the Black man who has made this undeclared choice. And that is the choice to leave the Black community and assimilate into whiteness for power and domination. The Black woman is simply along for the ride. His actions in the 60s and in the civil rights movement have made an indelible imprint on the quality of our lives. Do we like what he has done? Are we satisfied to ride the tide of the changing interpretations of Black manhood? Can it sustain us and the nearly 50% of Black children who depend upon us? Can we afford to sit by and allow him to orchestrate our future? So 50 years ago, we were having these conversations. 30 years ago, these conversations continued in many books, but the one in particular that really changed me and changed the way I see the world is Gender Talk: The Struggle for Women's Equality in African American Communities. And this was authored by Johnetta Betch Cole and Beverly Guy Sheftall. And in this book, Johnetta B. Cole and Beverly Guy Sheftall, they actually harken back to Anna Julia Cooper's essay, and they echo her questions. And they ask, what would a vision of Black community transformation look like if gender were more central to our analytic framework? What might we learn from engaging in more systematic analyses of the struggles between race and gender within African American communities? What would we gain from reconceptualizing race loyalty differently so that the needs of Black women and men could be more fully realized? And so, in other words, they're asking this: why is race loyalty only about being good to Black men? Why can't being good to and for Black people be measured by how good you are to Black women, Black children, Black queer and trans people, Black disabled people? Why is it that if we want the best for our race, we have to center the needs of men and only men, especially when that manhood is defined by domination and violation of others? Why are those who cause harm with impunity not considered the race traitors, but those who speak up are? Are we so enthralled with the myth of male supremacy that we would seek to self abandon every chance we get and then call that self abandonment liberation, call that self abandonment reparation, call that self abandonment the restoration of the men in our communities? We've seen over the course of this episode that we have been begging these niggas to change for hundreds of years. We have been begging Black men to move out of the narcissism, out of the patriarchal death bomb that is manhood, defined through a virulent, violent masculinity. This not only harms us on a personal level, but the allowance of this kind of violence into our communities without accountability is what destabilizes our movements. People want to talk about informants. They want to talk about COINTELPRO. They want to talk about all these other ways the government sabotages. But nobody want to talk about the sabotage that happens when Black men rape in our communities. The sabotage that happens when Black trans people are turned away through transmisogynistic and other forms of gendered violence. We don't want to talk about how our movements are destabilized when men are yelling in movement spaces over others, are throwing around the weight of their penis to be heard. In 2010, Courtney Desiree Morris published the essay, Why Misogynists Make Great Informants. And in this essay, Morris discusses how gendered violence against women, children, and trans and queer people actually does the same kind of destabilizing work that a government-sponsored informant does. The government might as well be paying you niggas for the shit that y'all be doing to destroy our communities. And so many of us in these spaces, we submit to this logic. We participate in this logic of the importance of the men, the cis men in particular, in our communities, when we fail to address gender violence in our movement spaces adequately. So many times I've seen a Black man violate and then be put in a position of power in a movement space because folks believe that it is their job and their role to atone for the state's wrongdoing. And then people wonder why organizations don't last. They wonder why movements are not powerful or impactful. And it's because you're trying to perpetuate the status quo, but put a nigga face on it. But Morris talks about this specifically in our movements. To save our movements, we need to come to terms with the connections between gender violence, male privilege, and the strategies that informants and people who act just like them use to destabilize radical movements. Time and again, heterosexual men in radical movements have been allowed to assert their privilege and subordinate others. Despite all that we say to the contrary, the fact is that radical social movements and organizations in the United States have refused to seriously address gender violence as a threat to the survival of our struggles. We've treated misogyny, homophobia, and heterosexism as lesser evils, secondary issues that will eventually take care of themselves or fade into the background once the real issues, racism, the police, class equality, U.S. wars of aggression, are resolved. There are serious consequences for choosing ignorance. Misogyny and homophobia are central to the reproduction of violence in radical activist communities. Scratch a misogynist, and you'll find a homophobe. Scratch a little deeper, and you might find the makings of a future informant or someone who just destabilizes movements like informants do. There are scores of stories of women, of children, and of others who've experienced violence in Black and other liberation movements. And this violence isn't something that just crops up, right? The most recent one we've heard, right, is Dolores Huerta talking about her experiences being raped by Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez didn't pop up as a rapist overnight. The insidious and not so insidious ways that we allow misogyny, to infiltrate our spaces, that we allow a masculinist, dominant form of power, of oration, power building, of holding meetings, etc. The ways that we allow misogyny to exist in our movements is what allows this type of violence to happen. When we say that we prioritize the safety of the misogynist, we center them in their comfort, and we call that community. We call that abolition. We create and sustain spaces in which those who are actually doing the work continue to experience oppression. We create spaces that are concentrated forms of harm, like little microcosms of the status quo. Over hundreds of years, as we've heard today, Black women have been talking about the importance of speaking about our experiences. And I really appreciate what Michele Wallace says in the introduction to this edition of Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. It is my conviction that the only way to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past is to openly discuss them. Whether in nations, families, or individuals, the practice of being on speaking terms with your past lives is the only thing that makes it possible to trust yourself or anybody else. Freedom, liberation, happiness, and fulfillment don't come naturally. Rather, they must be struggled for, moment by moment, against the tide of institutionalization, commodification, and repression. So often folks will tell us that talking about our experiences, the violence that we experience, they would frame that as being race traitordom, right? They would frame that as us turning away from the race. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it race betrayal to discuss the harm that we've experienced at the hands, by the mouths, by the feet, by the words of Black men? Why are the quote unquote leaders and the quote unquote future of our community? Why are they so afraid to reflect upon the past and change? And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we believe that accountability, true accountability for these kind of harms and actions are the things that will end our movements rather than the actions themselves? And Morris says, maybe if organizers made collective accountability around gender violence a central part of our practices, we could neutralize people who are working on behalf of the state to undermine our struggles. I'm not talking about witch hunts. I'm talking about organizing in such a way that we nip a potential Brendane Darby, who's one of the figures that they write about in the article, in the bud before he could hurt more people. Informants are hard to spot, but my guess is that where there is smoke, there is fire. And someone who creates chaos wherever he goes is either an informant or an irresponsible, unaccountable time bomb who can be unintentionally as effective at undermining social justice organizing as an informant. Ultimately, they both do the work of the state and need to be held accountable. And Moore says, one of the reasons it is so difficult to hold men of color accountable for reproducing gender violence is that women of color and white activists continue to be invested in the idea that men of color have it harder than anybody else. How do you hold someone accountable when you believe that he is target number one for the state? You don't. You then make everyone, yourself included, suffer and atone for the state's wrongdoing. But this has real material impact on our movements. And I'm going to read this lengthy quote from Morris because it really does something for me. And so they list a group of guys who you might see in any typical organizing space, like a description of them, which I thought was pretty apt. And they say, most of those guys probably weren't informants, which is a pity because it means they are not getting paid a dime for all the destructive work they do. We might think of these misogynists as inadvertent agents of the state. Regardless of whether they are actually informants or not, the work that they do supports the state's ongoing campaign of terror against social movements and the people who create them. When queer organizers are humiliated and their political struggles sidelined, that is part of an ongoing state project of violence against radicals. When women are knowingly given STIs, physically abused, dismissed in meetings, pushed aside, and forced out of radical organizing spaces while their allies defend known misogynists, organizers collude in the state's efforts to destroy us. The state has already understood a fact that the left has struggled to accept. Misogynists make great informants. Before or regardless of whether they are ever recruited by the state to disrupt a movement or destabilize an organization, they've likely become well versed in practices of disruptive behavior. They require almost no training and can start the work immediately. What's more paralyzing to our work than when women and or queer folks leave our movements because they have been repeatedly lied to, humiliated, physically, verbally, emotionally, and sexually abused, or when you have to postpone conversations about the work so that you can devote group meetings to addressing an individual's member's most recent offense, or when that person spreads misinformation, creating confusion and friction among radical groups. Nothing slows down movement building like a misogynist. What the FBI gets is that when there are people in activist spaces who are committed to taking power and who understand power as domination, our movements will never realize their potential to remake this world. If our energies are absorbed recuperating from the messes that informants and the people who act just like them create, we will never be able to focus on the real work of getting free and building the kinds of life affirming, people centered communities that we want to live in. To paraphrase Bell Hooks, where there is a will to dominate, there can be no justice, because we will inevitably continue reproducing the same kinds of injustice we claim to be struggling against. It is time for our movements to undergo a radical change from the inside out. And this is work that we all must take up. As a Black feminist abolitionist, I believe that we must build systems of accountability for when violence happens in our communities. Accountability is not punishment. Accountability is a mutual process where the harm doer recognizes the harm they've caused and takes measures to right the wrongs that they've caused. On the other hand, punishment is wielded by power and authority. No recognition of wrongdoing is necessary. No restitution is necessary. And I know that you niggas can't and don't read, so you don't know the difference. And I know that a lot of your mothers and others around you probably didn't teach you accountability. They probably picked you up as the boy baby, now the man baby, and refused to let you face the consequences of your actions, which is why you would get on the internet and bitch and moan and call for the death or the rape of a woman like me who will call for you to be accountable. They didn't teach you accountability. So you probably can only perceive receiving consequences for your actions as punishment and as something akin to death. And when I see niggas say you're calling for the death of Black men by calling for them to be accountable, all it does is make me wonder, first, what the fuck is wrong with you? And second of all, what the fuck have you done? I didn't say that you needed to die for your actions. So why do you believe that? It seems that those who raised you have failed you in some key ways. And it would help you to have a less lonely, pitiful, and pathetic existence, to read some feminist works on accountability and start working on yourselves. Do the changing that Black women have been calling for you to do for over the last few centuries. And stop listening to other lonely sociopathic people who subscribe to white supremacist and patriarchal violence. For those of us who do work on the left and we're trying to think about, okay, well, how do we know how to end this kind of culture in our movements? How do we know how to identify these misogynists? It's actually quite simple. We don't need to go on any witch hunts. We don't need to get on IG Live and say so-and-so didn't text me back, so they're abusive, or this and that didn't happen, right? Misogyny and misogynoir is a cultural thing. It happens in subtle and not so subtle ways. And so Morris points to some of them. Those misogynists and those informants, those saboteurs of the movement will out themselves every time they refuse to apologize, take ownership of their actions, start conflicts, and refuse to work them out through consensus. Every time they mistreat their compañeras. We don't have to look for them, but when we are presented with their destructive behaviors, we must hold them accountable. Our strategies don't have to be punitive. People are entitled to their mistakes, but I don't think that we can call rape a mistake. Mistake, right? So that I do disagree with. I don't think we can call those mistakes, but we should expect that people will own their actions and not allow them to become a pattern. So when they have become a pattern, we can also hold them accountable in ways that don't allow them to continue to perpetuate harm in our communities. We have a right to be angry when the communities we build that are supposed to be the model for a better, more just world harbor the same kinds of anti-queer, anti-woman, racist violence that pervades society. As radical organizers, we must hold each other accountable and not enable misogynists to assert so much power in these spaces. We must not allow them to be the faces, voices, and leaders of these movements. Not allow them to rape a compañera and then be on the fucking 5 o'clock news. By not allowing misogyny to take root in our communities and movements, we not only protect ourselves from the efforts of the state to destroy our work, but also create stronger movements that cannot be destroyed from within. The longer that we continue to refuse to hold the men in our communities accountable for their violent acts, the longer we will continue to submit to our own oppression. There should be and are true consequences to allowing those who harm to remain in community without accountability. Misogyny kills. And not only does it kill, it only leaves a pathway for our movements to be destroyed. Let's take a look at some of these tweets for those of you who's still around. So this one from Dr. Hood Scholar says, the most violent, vitriol, harassing verbal attacks and actual harm I've experienced has come from Black feminists. At Brendane, your girl. Words aren't hyperbole. They really are hurting us. This is why we have been sounding the alarm about feminisms. And this is a quoted tweet response to Just Met at Abatunse saying, quote, listen to Black feminists. You mean the people openly calling for my death? It is time for Black men to face the consequences of their actions. What does this mean? So since some of y'all don't know what that means, y'all don't know what consequences are, let me tell you. Consequences are defined as something that comes as a result of something that you do. So if you haven't done something, then you can't face consequences for it. Segregation, racism, the Black man's illiteracy rate are not the consequences of your actions. They are simply the conditions in which we all live. But if you are insistent upon being a victim, well, baby, here's your victim crown. But I will say this complex is really weird, and you need to get over yourselves. There was a response to this tweet by someone who claims that he knows me. And I'll be honest, Swindelium, I know of you. But what I know of you was the common sense knowledge among undergraduate women that there was a certain graduate student who was in our spaces spending time around us that should not be there, who was trying to engage in romantic relationships with some of us. Now, you and I have never had a conversation, not to my recollection, because of this knowledge that I have received. But please, let's share with the class what you claim to know about me. And he says, she went to Duke when I was there. There was definitely a strain of this fascistic ideology nurtured there. So we went to the same school, but for some reason he missed the fascist ideology, but I didn't. These types of Negroes are too afraid to even think about challenging the whites who microaggress them. So instead they fantasize about Black men facing consequences. What is so funny about this statement from someone who I don't know, who then follows me on platforms before they were blocked, was that I was one of the major people who were involved in racial justice movements on that same campus where I learned that fascist ideology. The reason why women of all races no longer have to deal with a racist and misogynist dean to adjudicate their cases of sexual misconduct, baby, that's because of me. That's because of the organizing work that I've done. The white people who know me are afraid of me. But you wouldn't know that, bitch, because you have no clue who the fuck I am. But trust me, I know about you. And now the world does too. Here's this one. When have black men avoided consequences for their actions? Overall, they're packed in prison, hunted by police, and we have the highest infant deaths overall by our mothers. You have a PhD and live in Baltimore. They building $1 billion jail, which will be packed with black men. Again, some of y'all don't know what consequences are. And I get it. It's because you probably cannot and do not read. Picking up a dictionary is just a bit too hard for you. How in the fuck is an infant death a consequence of a black man's actions? How is being hunted by the police, the former slave catchers, the consequences of black men's actions, rather than what I've said, which are the conditions in which we all live, but somehow, some way, make you a special victim, red shirt 990. So much so that you have to put out information about me on the internet that you can find by literally just looking me the fuck up. Now, Hikari Uber, this one, probably a bot, whatever. And this is why, right, it's important for us to understand that misogynoir opens the door for all different forms of violence against black women. I don't know if this person is black or not. They don't love themselves enough to show themselves in their Abby, so I don't know. But they say, this whipped dog wouldn't dare put out a video talking about how white people are going to face consequences for their actions, like she did for black men. The racist white liberal academy would smoke her boots. So not only am I scared of white people, even though I've done over a decade of racial justice work. I've been at protests. I have organized marches. I've done lots of things. Even though I've written papers and created courses and curriculum that would teach white people and others about the consequences of their actions. I'm scared. I'm so scared. Black Avi, all black, who knows? But this is the tamest threat that I would put in this video. In response to my tweet that says, LOL, because what are people doing that they think consequences equals death? Y'all are telling on yourselves. This person quote tweeted me and said, be careful playing on the internet. Someone you don't know might choose to make your life not worth living. I want to get this straight. There is nothing that anyone outside of me could do to make me feel like my life is not worth living. My life is my own, and I choose when I will lay it down. You, stranger who can only make threats from behind an anonymous account, will never make me feel like my glorious presence does not need to be here. So you be careful playing on the internet. The other one that I thought was really interesting, and again, it speaks to this victim complex that black men have, says, and I quote, black men are already at the bottom of every metric for quality of life. What else is there to take from black men other than their lives? But it's cool. The consequences of the black feminist grift just cost black women 100K jobs in 1 month. Shout out to BLM. I don't know why you celebrating, baby. The black woman that's supporting you, taking care of you, because statistically, you niggas was unemployed before that anyway. The reason why black women could afford to lose that many jobs is because they had them in the first place. Black men can't afford to lose that many jobs because they don't have them in the first place. I don't know why you would say something like that when you most likely are relying upon a black woman's labor to sustain your life. Black men love to be victims. Y'all are simultaneously the untapped power and potential of the Black community and the leaders of our household. Yet across all races and genders, Black cisgender men do the least amount of household work and care work. It's been proven in multiple studies. Y'all do like 2.5 hours a week of care work because it is literally on the backs of everybody else in the fucking Black community to carry you and to care for you. White men, the ones that you are constantly in competition with and comparing yourselves to and wishing that you could be like, do more at home than y'all do. But I guess that is what makes you both superior and a victim. But in all honesty, I need y'all to pick a lane and stick to it. As long as we set the bar for real womanhood and real manhood to be what our oppressors have, we will never be free. Black liberation will never be found by letting Black men be violent as white men are. Black liberation will never be found through the patriarchy. It will never be found through misogyny. Our liberation will never be second to the real issues of race, of poverty, etc. And no matter how allegiant you are to the ideals, the people, and the institutions that oppress you, no matter how many trinkets they might give you to cover up your chains, it doesn't change the reality that you are still bound. It doesn't change the reality that you are still burdened. So let's not choose oppression. And if you are determined to choose your oppression, then I suggest you choose not to play with me.